What's up, nerds? Russia has a massive equipment problem, and this is going to impact their capabilities for their upcoming summer offensive. So we're going to talk about the losses that they've suffered so far and where they're at today, as well as where that could impact their ability to prosecute their offensive in the coming months. We're also going to talk about some of the solutions that they've come up with so far, some of them being pretty creative and unique. And of course, we're talking about all of this on April 10th, 2024. Now, first, let's talk about why Russia has an equipment problem. They have simply lost a lot of heavy equipment since the start of the war. And by heavy equipment and armor, I'm kind of lumping together BMPs, BTRs, and tanks all together. I know that that's kind of an imperfect estimate, but whenever I'm kind of flipping through some of these different sources, a lot of them are kind of lumping them together, so it's kind of hard to get like a good, differential reading on these. There used to be, Oryx, which provided some pretty good tracking of Russian losses. However, that I've seen, Oryx has kind of stopped updating their listing on their website. So I'm kind of relying on some other sources right now. But according to Newsweek, Russia has lost nearly $55 billion in heavy equipment since the war started. Of their 2020, that's almost half of their 2024 defense budget, which is just huge. And that's not going to be rebuilt overnight. Over 3,000 armored vehicles, according to one UK think tank, have been lost. And that's actually a pretty conservative figure. According to Ukraine, they've destroyed over 7,000, which I think is a very big number. I think the real number is probably somewhere in between those two, but still no doubt a huge number. And a lot of that, just the 3,000 estimate is more than what Russia had in active service at the start of the war. So they've already, just with that number, they're having to lean on their Soviet inheritance, and we've seen that certainly in a pretty significant way. For instance, a video published by Covert Cabal here on YouTube released, where he basically analyzed different satellite images of several different Russian tank parks throughout the country of Russia that have been known to store large amounts of old Soviet tanks for use in a case like this. All but one of these tank parks have actually shrunk by a significant margin. That one that hasn't shrunk has actually grown by a little bit, but Covert Cabal speculates basically that tank park is basically being used for equipment, for maintenance, and basically equipment cannibalization, meaning, taking away parts from an older tank and using those parts to refurbish another one. From these images and from a separate video he had already made, I think it was about 6 months ago, basically analyzing the same thing, he assesses that at best Russia has about 2 to 2.5 years left, the current rate of consumption, until they run out of tanks altogether. That's pretty crazy, because that means we may be at the halfway point of this war, even a little bit past the halfway point. And again, that's given both the rate of consumption and the rate of production within Russia. Russia is producing some new tanks. However, often these tanks are just older tanks that are being refurbished with new parts. For instance, CNN estimated that around 125 tanks are being produced a month in Russia. However, according to a NATO estimate, 85% of those new tanks are actually just refurbished tanks, meaning there are tanks that are being pulled out of those old parks that we just talked about, being equipped with new equipment, basically modernized a little bit, and then sent off to the front. Now, of course, tanks aren't the only valuable piece of heavy equipment here. BTRs and BMPs also play a huge role. They can bring some relative speed and mobility and relative firepower to the fight, and of course, relative to, a dismounted infantry assault. But there are similar challenges that Russia's facing with those platforms as well. Not only for them to produce and retrofit them, but also just with the rate of consumption that those platforms are facing as well. For Russia to continue on with this war longer term, as in more than just 2 years, change is going to need to happen. And that's not just change with their industrial capacity, it's change with their tactics and strategy and how they're using this equipment. Not only had to account for different kinds of anti-tank munitions like ATGMs or shoulder-mounted weaponry, but also for drones, which have been a huge issue for armored vehicles. And the proliferation of mines all across the front line, which make driving around these areas incredibly dangerous. Now, up to this point, Russian tactics with heavy equipment and infantry have mostly been kind of the following, where armored vehicles ferry infantry forward to the line of contact, the infantry dismounts, the armor provides fire support for the infantry, and the infantry advances and seizes the objective. Now, what's happened so far in this war is that they're under fire the entire way, often passing through open terrain where they're spotted by the enemy and able to be targeted. The density of Ukrainian defenses have managed to destroy much of the armor, not only with indirect fire, but with direct fire and drones. And what you have left is basically the infantry, and they just get killed in the open without any kinds of support or means of evacuation. Russia has basically been repeating the strategy over and over and over and over and over again. And the remnants of each assault, the survivors of each assault, basically, they huddle together and then they wait until they're in sufficient strength to attack themselves, closer to the line. Of course, they're also all waiting for the Ukrainian defense to become exhausted and for them to run out of ammunition, and that allows Russia to attack forward as well. And that is actually becoming a bigger and bigger trend, and we've talked a little bit already about how Ukraine is struggling to get more ammunition and how, NATO and the United States are really struggling to produce that ammunition in the first place. However, with the Czech initiative, Ukraine may be receiving well over 1 million artillery rounds, likely starting in June. So that trend actually may have an expiration date, at least for now. So all this means that Russia is going to have to come up with more and more creative ways to mitigate the loss of their heavy equipment and armored vehicles while getting the infantry forward. The use of lighter vehicles like golf carts, buggies, and motorcycles, these have been seen and reported and shown online. For instance, an image showed that the 1st Guards Tank Army is using golf carts to get infantry forward. Now, obviously, what these have in speed, they completely lack in protection and firepower. I think that these are really more just examples of, these attempts to continue these assaults, which we'll talk about why that's happening here in a bit. However, we also saw yesterday a really interesting kind of case study here where the Russians welded a massive metal dome over a tank. And reportedly, this was successful. This allowed the tank to get close up to the Ukrainian line and even retrograde back to the Russian line. Now, what this dome does is it sacrifices visibility and fire radius for protection. The only way to kill this thing would be either with a mine where you can target it from basically under the tank, or with a drone where you're targeting it through the front of the dome where the armor is strongest, or through the back, which is not facing you, that's facing away from you. Or using a heavier munition that you probably won't have on hand that might take some time to get onto station, if they have it at all. Now, in theory, this looks kind of smart, honestly. It looks very silly, and they should be cyberbullied for that. So let's all take a moment to point and laugh. Everybody post in the comments, LOL, Russian don't, I don't know, something. Come up with something clever. But at the same time, it needs to be considered that battlefield innovations are rarely aesthetic. And if it was in fact successful, then that's something to consider. These kinds of battlefield innovations are hard-learned lessons that become implemented later on. So why does this all matter? Are we about to see the entirety of the rest of the Russian tank fleet have domes on them? Or, are we going to see how they're using their armor used differently later? Well, we all know that Russia is planning a summer offensive, and there's another mobilization coming soon with the reported target to include 150 Russians to be mobilized. Past mobilizations in Russia have included way more than what the reported number was. For instance, in previous mobilizations, Russia attempted to recruit, at least publicly, over 300,000 Russians. However, over time, the true number of those mobilized was well above that number. We know that the goal for the Russian total army size is around 1.5 million service people. And that's not just for fighting in Ukraine. That includes other kinds of security duties. Like, they're still in Syria. They still have an extensive border around Asia. They have other kinds of security things that they need to be looking at. So that 1.5 million isn't all going to Ukraine, but certainly a large chunk of them probably will be. Now, with that spike in the amount of infantry that Russia has to play with, there will probably be an increase in reliance on dismounted infantry assaults. And we can kind of see that with the use of golf carts and lighter, faster vehicles to get infantry forward. Now, the drawbacks is that these are slower attacks. They're unable to capitalize on breaches in Ukrainian defenses. However, that allows Russia to conserve its heavy equipment to exploit those gaps once they're found. For instance, they can attack with lighter, more disposable troops, continue that for a long period of time, and identify areas of weakness, either areas where they have managed to attrit the Ukrainian defense or where they have identified that the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. And once they've identified those areas, then that is where they can target with heavy equipment and a more concerted armored thrust, something more similar to what we would have expected Russia to do, up to this point. I would say that this is probably the most dangerous course of action that they could do, where they consolidate, around one part of the front line, and they choose to exploit it based on that area's relative weakness after having drained, the Ukrainian defense with just lighter kinds of assault. The takeaway from that, or the counter to that, is really, Ukraine's ability to target areas of consolidation well behind the front line. This has been something that Ukraine has done very frequently. However, with heavy equipment, they could consolidate those forces fairly quickly. So it would require a pretty fast kill chain on Ukraine's part and good, reliable intelligence to identify those consolidation areas and target it with heavy fires. That's how Ukraine could easily, put the kibosh on those kinds of attacks. Now, the most likely course of action is probably more of the same of what we've already seen. Heavy equipment continues to shuttle infantry forward. Again, this doesn't necessarily rely on these kinds of mass consolidations of forces, so it reduces the threat of, Ukrainian heavy fires. But it forces Russia to just continue the strategy that's not really been going too well and that has attrited their force so much to this point. The heavy equipment shuttles the infantry forward, and everything gets targeted until eventually either the Ukrainian defenses are attrited or they run out of ammunition, and then Russia can continue to press forward that way. But again, this is slower. This is way more attritional. It will cause way greater losses to the Russian force over time. And the gains that they'll be gaining on the map are tiny. It's a field here, a tree line there, a ditch over there, maybe a city block by city block. And we're not talking about a massive breakthrough where they're shooting all the way out to the Dnieper River. We're probably just not. We're not going to see that. I don't think that the Russian military has that kind of capacity at this time, and won't be able to get that capacity for quite a long time. Now, why I think that their withholding of heavy equipment is not the most likely. That's, again, not to say that it won't happen, but it's going off of what we've seen so far. And again, kind of that threat of Ukrainian counteraction of just long-range fires against, areas of consolidation. There's also a political purpose behind these kinds of routine, constant, small-scale assaults that we've seen. It applies pressure on the Ukrainian defense, for example. I mean, this is more of a military purpose. It applies constant pressure on the Ukrainian defense. It forces the Ukrainians to consume troops and ammo just to defend against those kinds of attacks. And again, it allows Russia to be able to probe those defenses and know where the areas of weakness are. Now, the political need is to show progress, and there's no visible progress in a fight whenever there's no fighting happening. Now, that obviously gives, if there were to be a pause in the fighting, that would give both Russia and Ukraine time to rest, refit their troops, and prepare for the next round. But in this case, where there's constant fighting going on different parts of the front line, especially with those small teams and small groups, that shows, in a brief, that fighting continues to happen and that progress is being made and that the initiative remains on the Russian side. And again, that's more of a political thing. These attacks aren't designed to succeed. They're just designed to probe. We have to remember that, for instance, Sergei Shoigu is a politician, and much of the Russian political leadership, especially at the higher level, they're more into the political, game than they are military strategy at this point. And we know this because of how this war has been fought so far. We expected, the competence of their military leadership to be much higher than what we've seen, and that's why, at the outside of this war, everybody pretty much expected Russia to have this thing finished up fairly quickly. That we're, in year number 3 of this fight, and Russia is basically fought to a standstill despite having overwhelming superiority in equipment, manpower, everything. That kind of tells you something about what the leadership is like. That's not to say that there isn't some competent leadership within their military structure. I mean, we've seen learning and innovation being done. We've talked about some of that even in just this video. But those issues are too systemic and top-down. And really what we've seen from the Russian structure, even back to the Soviet area, it's a very top-down kind of structure. It relies on leadership at the upper levels and not the bottom areas. Now, for Ukraine to counter all of this, of course, we know that they need more ammunition. There's the June date for the Czech initiative where that ammunition is expected to start arriving in Ukraine. The European and United States defense industrial bases need to continue to spool up and get ammunition produced. Of course, political considerations here in the U.S. need to get sorted out as well as personnel issues within Ukraine. There's a mobilization law that's being debated in Ukraine right now and being worked on. Zelensky reportedly signed a extension to the mobilization age down to 25 from 27 so they can recruit more people. And, Ukraine needs to continue to develop their defensive line to hold the front line and let the Russian military basically deplete itself with these kinds of just consistent assaults. And then once Ukraine has depleted itself to the point that their offensive is culminated, then Ukraine can exploit that with a counteroffensive. However, again, they need to do that carefully, perhaps slowly, because remember, last time didn't go so well and the Surovikin line didn't go anywhere. Now, subscribe if you want to follow along all of this with us. We're going to continue to analyze the war in Ukraine. We are analyzing other conflicts that are going on as well. And like this video if you found it helpful or informative. Definitely comment your thoughts on what we've talked about so far. Not only, cyberbullying, the aesthetic decision behind that dome tank, but also, just let me know what your analysis is of this issue. Let's continue this conversation. So with all that, I'll talk to you all next time. Later.